Welcome, science people, and welcome to the Science Shelter. My name is Ian Puebla, and I'm going to be telling you about my billion-dollar disaster in this video. So, my billion-dollar disaster is the central and eastern United States winter storm and cold front that hit in December of 2022. Now, the National Environmental Information Center describes this billion-dollar disaster as a historical winter storm and powerful Arctic front that caused a lot of precipitation, such as rainfall and snow, to hit much of the United States. And they also explain that nearly 200 million people were affected by this cold front, and as well as about 1 million people from Texas to Maine were left without power. Now, I don't have the marker budget of the esteemed Sturmer Studios, so I'm using colored pencils here, and I am going to draw a couple angry clouds to represent our angry storm. And like I just said, this billion-dollar disaster affected a lot of people and had a lot of associated damage, most of which was a lot of people getting stuck on their routes and roads, not being able to get to places, but more importantly and more damage causing was a lot of frozen pipes. People's pipes would freeze and then they would burst. Water would spew out and would go all over, getting our little squirrel here and damaging houses and important infrastructure. Now, I am going to pass you on to In the Field, Ian, to go more in depth about the damages brought by this billion-dollar disaster. Now, I just pulled you out of my freezer to give you just a little taste of what the 200 million people in the central and eastern United States had to go through during that December 22 winter storm. And with that, it brought a lot of damage and destruction, about $4.8 billion of damage according to the NCEI. And even more sadly, about 87 lives were lost during this winter storm. Thank you, In the Field, Ian. So, again, this is far from the only billion-dollar disaster to happen in the past 20 years. From 2003 to 2023, there are actually 9 events, all of which that happened as 2010 onward, and 4 of those 9 actually happened in the last 5 years to great cost. In the past 20 years, you could see it cost $45.6 billion, all 9 of those events, to great cost in life, about 466 lives. So not only has this happened quite often in the past 20 years, but it's happening at a much quicker rate. Now, meteorologically speaking, what caused this disaster to happen was a Arctic front. Now, our textbook explains that an Arctic front is actually an air mass that forms over the Arctic Ocean and is then propelled down south over to, in this case, the United States, where it then brings that cold cold Arctic air down with it. Now, the Arctic polar front that was responsible for this billion-dollar disaster is actually affected and influenced by climate change. According to our textbook, the effects of climate change are more pronounced in the northern hemisphere, specifically the Arctic warming. And according to the NOAA Climate Program Office, they stated that the stretching of the polar vortex will allow this polar air to dip down south, which happened with this billion-dollar disaster. And that is due to something called Arctic amplification, which is just a fancy way of saying Arctic warming. So there's a clear and distinct connection between climate change and this billion-dollar disaster.
Now, climate change and weather didn't play the only factor in this billion-dollar disaster's damages. In fact, also were our poor infrastructures. People's power failed, so then they had no heat and their houses were frozen. I drew this house in an ice cube to demonstrate that. And then first responders were trapped on roads that weren't properly cleared, so they weren't able to get to those people that were in need of help. So obviously we could better prepare for these sort of billion-dollar disasters by strengthening our infrastructure power-wise, and also preparing for immense snowfall and clearing roads so first responders can get to those people. But ultimately, the best way that we could prepare for a billion-dollar disasters like this is to lessen our emissions, and so we lower our climate change so that these disasters can be avoided in the first place.